"Sir, financing is mandatory for all customers." These words echoed through the elegant showroom of the BMW dealership in Union Square like a decree that no one dared to question. To understand how we arrived at this moment that would shake an entire dealership and change a veteran manager's perspective on business, we need to go back a few hours, when a busy Saturday promised to be just another day of routine sales. You can perceive that some encounters are like seeds of destiny, planted in seemingly ordinary moments, but destined to blossom into extraordinary lessons. James Wilson, at 45 years old, would never imagine that his meticulously organized routine would be challenged by a customer who would appear wearing faded jeans and a simple hoodie, carrying with him the power to completely transform his understanding about flexibility in business. The aroma of premium leather mixed with the smell of espresso that perfumed the air conditioning of the BMW dealership, creating that sophisticated atmosphere that only luxury showrooms can produce. It was impossible not to feel the pulsating energy of Union Square entering through the large glass windows, where pedestrians walked hurriedly, and the distant sound of San Francisco traffic created a constant urban symphony. James Wilson adjusted his Italian tie for the third time that morning, checking every detail of his appearance in the reflection of a gleaming black BMW X7 M50 DFIS. 15 years selling luxury. Cars had shaped not only his expertise, but also a work philosophy based on rigid protocols and procedures that, according to him, never failed. "We have our procedures for a reason," he murmured to himself while observing his team of salespeople interacting with potential customers. It was a phrase he repeated daily to the newcomers, a philosophy he had learned through decades dealing with Silicon Valley millionaires, technology entrepreneurs, and heirs to family fortunes. How many times in life do we learn that success can become a trap when it makes us too inflexible? James had built his reputation on the premise that well-defined procedures were the difference between amateur salespeople and professionals who consistently hit targets. For him, each protocol had been tested, refined, and approved through years of experience. The showroom buzzed with that characteristic energy of a busy Saturday. The sound of high heels echoed on the Italian marble floor, mixing with conversations, in low tones, and the occasional rumble of an engine being started in the test drive area. Customers dressed in designer clothes walked among the displayed vehicles as if they were art pieces in a private museum. James knew the profile of every customer who entered his dealership. Technology executives who wanted the latest model to impress colleagues. Wives of businessmen seeking SUVs that combined luxury with practicality. Young entrepreneurs who had sold startups and wanted to celebrate with a sports car. All of them had something in common. They accepted financing even when they could pay cash. Something that deeply touches the business world is understanding that preserving liquidity is smarter than spending cash, even for the very wealthy. James had learned this lesson by observing his most successful clients, and that's why he had implemented a clear policy: mandatory financing to maximize dealership profits. It was approximately noon when James noticed a young man entering discreetly into the showroom. Faded jeans, casual sneakers, hoodie with hood. Definitely not the typical profile of someone who buys six-figure BMWs, but James had learned not to judge by appearance. Some of the richest clients in San Francisco purposely dressed simply. Suddenly, everything changed when the young man approached the BMW X7 M50 Wayman that occupied the central position in the showroom. His eyes examined the vehicle with the knowledge of someone who understood cars. His hands touched the finishes with the familiarity of someone who had already owned luxury vehicles. There was something in his posture that James couldn't completely categorize. What no one expected was that this casual encounter would become a lesson about when rigid procedures can become obstacles to extraordinary opportunities. James walked toward the potential customer, adjusting his professional posture and preparing his standard sales pitch, not imagining that he was about to face a situation that no sales manual had anticipated. "We have our procedures for a reason," echoed in his mind as he approached, not knowing that this familiar phrase was about to be tested in a way that would forever change his perspective on the true meaning of flexibility in business. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when well-intentioned protocols were about to collide with a reality that James Wilson had never imagined possible. James Wilson approached the customer with that professional smile that 15 years of sales had perfected, his Italian shoes creating a confident rhythm on the marble floor. The ambient sound of the dealership, discreet conversations, pages of catalogs being turned, the soft hum of air conditioning, formed the perfect soundtrack for what he believed to be just another routine sale. "Good afternoon," James greeted, extending his hand with the calculated firmness of someone who knew how to establish authority from the first contact. "I'm James Wilson, sales manager. I see you're interested in our X7 M50i. Excellent choice. You can perceive that some moments define not only business, but also character." Steph Curry returned the handshake naturally, his eyes still examining the vehicle's details with the attention of someone who truly understood automotive engineering. There was something in his posture that James recognized, the silent confidence of someone accustomed to quality. "It's an impressive car," Steph replied, running his hand over the panel finish. "I'm interested in buying it. What would be the final price for cash payment?" The question hung in the air like an unexpected musical note in a familiar symphony. It was impossible not to feel how James processed those words, his expression subtly changing from welcome to that professional rigidity that emerged whenever procedures needed to be explained. "Well, sir," James paused, waiting for the customer's name. "Steph," came the simple reply. "Steph, the vehicle's price is $120,000, but our policy is clear. Financing is mandatory for all customers, regardless of cash payment capacity." How is it possible that a business policy can sound so inflexible when spoken aloud? Steph tilted his head slightly, an expression of genuine confusion crossing his face. The smell of premium leather emanating from the BMW's interior mixed with the coffee aroma coming from the waiting area, creating a sensory contrast that echoed the growing tension between convenience and rigidity. "Mandatory financing?" Steph repeated, his voice carrying a note of incredulity. "Even if I want to pay the full amount today?" James felt that familiar sensation that always emerged when he needed to defend policies that some customers questioned. "We have our procedures for a reason," he thought, remembering all the times this approach had resulted in higher profits for the dealership. "Exactly," James confirmed, his posture becoming more formal. "We earn significantly more from financing interest and associated products like extended insurance. Besides, even our most affluent clients prefer to preserve liquidity. It's an intelligent financial strategy. Something that deeply touches the modern business world is the tendency to transform strategies into inflexible dogmas." James had observed this truth being confirmed hundreds of times. Silicon Valley executives who could buy entire fleets of BMWs always opted for financing, not out of necessity, but out of fiscal intelligence. "I understand the logic," Steph said, walking around the vehicle with measured steps. "But what if my situation is different?" At that moment, other salespeople began to notice the conversation. Jennifer Walsh, an experienced saleswoman, whispered something to a colleague while discreetly observing. There was something familiar about that customer that she couldn't completely identify, something that made her memory itch like a word on the tip of her tongue. "Mr. Steph," James continued, his voice gaining that tone of authority he used to discourage questioning, "our policy has no exceptions. The system simply doesn't allow sales without financing. We have our procedures for a reason, and that reason is to maximize value for both the company and the customer. What would you do if you discovered that your most solid convictions are about to be tested by a situation that no manual anticipated?" Steph stopped walking and stared directly at James, their expressions meeting in a moment that seemed to carry much more weight than a simple commercial transaction. "And if," Steph said, his voice maintaining a calm that contrasted with James's growing rigidity, "I bring the money in cash? $120,000 in cash?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer Walsh stopped pretending to organize documents and looked directly at the scene. Other customers slowed their pace to listen better. Even the ambient sound of the dealership seemed to have diminished, as if the showroom itself was holding its breath. How many times in life does a moment of inflexibility become the catalyst for extraordinary discoveries? James felt something moving in his chest, a mixture of discomfort and curiosity that he couldn't categorize. In 15 years of career, no customer had made such a direct offer. "Cash?" James repeated, his voice betraying slight uncertainty for the first time in that conversation. "Well, that would be irregular. Our system—" "Your system," Steph interrupted gently but firmly, "can adapt to reality, or will reality adapt to your system?" Suddenly, the atmosphere in the showroom changed completely. It was as if an electric current had run through the environment, awakening something that was sleeping. Jennifer Walsh approached discreetly, her eyes widening with growing recognition. Other employees began to position themselves to hear the conversation better without seeming obvious. "We have our procedures for a reason," echoed in James's mind. But this time, the phrase carried a different flavor. A question instead of an affirmation. And for the first time in 15 years, he began to question whether his reasons were as solid as he had always believed. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when reality was about to surpass any fiction that James Wilson had ever imagined possible. Steph Curry looked at James Wilson with that calm smile that millions of fans knew from basketball courts, but which at that moment carried something different. A silent determination that made the dealership air seem denser. The sound of a page being turned in some catalog echoed like a distant drum, marking the seconds of a silence that was about to be broken spectacularly. "All right," Steph said, his words flowing with the naturalness of someone who had made a definitive decision. "I'll go get the money. I'll be back in an hour." You can perceive that there are moments in life when reality prepares to surpass any expectation, like when clouds gather before a storm that no one saw coming. James Wilson watched that apparently ordinary customer walk toward the exit, feeling a strange mixture of skepticism and curiosity growing in his chest, like an uneasiness he couldn't name. "He won't come back," Jennifer Walsh murmured, approaching James with that expression that experienced salespeople develop when they sense lost sales. Customers like that always say they're going to get the money and never show up again. It was impossible not to feel the energy change in the showroom. Other salespeople resumed their normal activities. The buzz of conversations returned to usual volume, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed again with the smell of premium leather, without the electric tension that had dominated the atmosphere in the last few minutes. James spent the next hour reviewing financing proposals and serving other customers, but part of his mind remained occupied with that unusual conversation. How is it possible for someone to offer $120,000 in cash as if it were the most natural thing in the world? In 15 years of career, he had seen ostentation, eccentricity, and power, but never something so direct. "We have our procedures for a reason," he repeated mentally, trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing by maintaining the company policy. But for the first time, the familiar phrase sounded less like an absolute truth and more like a question without a definitive answer. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the showroom buzzed with the typical energy of a busy Saturday, the main door opened again. Steph Curry entered carrying a black leather briefcase, discreet but clearly expensive, his steps creating that same confident rhythm from an hour before. This time, however, there was something different in his posture. A determination that made several heads turn in his direction. Something that deeply touches the human heart is witnessing the moment when someone transforms words into actions so literally that it challenges our understanding of what is possible. Steph walked directly to James, placed the briefcase on the glass table where catalogs were scattered, and said simply, "Here is the complete payment." The sound of the briefcase latch being opened echoed through the showroom like a shot that silenced all conversations. Jennifer Walsh dropped the EBT pen she was holding. A couple examining a BMW 7 Series stopped mid-sentence. Even the salesperson talking on the phone lowered his tone to almost a whisper. Suddenly, reality surpassed any fiction that James Wilson had ever imagined. Inside the briefcase, organized in perfectly aligned bundles and protected by rubber bands, were $120,000 in $100 bills. The smell of new money mixed with the leather aroma of the briefcase, creating a fragrance that no sales manual had described. "My God," Jennifer murmured, approaching with wide eyes. "He really brought the money." How many times in life do we witness the exact moment when our most solid convictions are put to the test by raw reality? James felt his internal world trembling like a building during an earthquake. Each certainty he had built about procedures and protocols beginning to crack under the weight of that demonstration of financial power. "Now," Steph said, his voice maintaining that calm that contrasted dramatically with the visible shock on James's face, "can we process the sale without financing?" It was impossible to ignore what was happening around. Other customers approached discreetly, attracted by a scene that was definitely not routine in any luxury dealership. Salespeople pretended to organize documents to stay closer. Even the sales director emerged from his office, attracted by the growing buzz. "Wait a minute," Jennifer suddenly said, her eyes lighting up with recognition. You're Steph Curry, the Golden State Warriors player." The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the showroom itself was processing this information, recalibrating the entire situation through a completely new lens. James felt blood rising to his face when reality finally clicked in his mind like puzzle pieces fitting together. What would you do if you discovered that you applied inflexible procedures to someone who could buy your entire company without blinking? James looked at the money, then at Steph Curry, then at the sales team watching him with expressions ranging from admiration to barely disguised amusement. "Steph Curry," James repeated, his voice coming out hoarser than normal. "The Steph Curry. And I was explaining to you about liquidity preservation?" Steph smiled, and for the first time since he had entered the dealership, there was nothing challenging in his expression. There was something that seemed like understanding, perhaps even compassion. "Sometimes," he said gently, "procedures need to adapt to reality, not the other way around." "We have our procedures for a reason," echoed in James's mind for the third time that day. But now, the phrase carried completely different weight. And for the first time in 15 years of career, he began to question whether his reasons were really as unquestionable as he had always believed. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when James Wilson discovered that true business leadership sometimes means having the courage to break your own rules when the situation transcends any manual. James Wilson remained motionless for a few seconds that seemed like eternity, his eyes alternating between the money organized in the briefcase and Steph Curry's calm face. The sound of his own breathing seemed amplified amid the expectant silence that had taken over the showroom. It was as if 15 years of certainties were being reorganized in his mind like puzzle pieces that finally found their correct configuration. James began, his voice failing for the first time in decades of professional presentations. The smell of premium leather and new money created an olfactory mixture he would never forget. "I need to adapt our procedures." You can perceive that some moments in life offer us the opportunity to choose between rigidity that limits us and flexibility that transforms us. James walked to his computer, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened the sales system. The bright blue screen reflected in his eyes like a portal to a new understanding of what it really meant to serve exceptional customers. "I'll process the sale as cash payment," James announced, his voice gaining strength and clarity with each word. "No financing, no unnecessary complications." The buzz that followed was like music to Steph Curry, who observed the transformation happening not only in James, but in the entire team around. Jennifer Walsh smiled with admiration. Other salespeople whispered among themselves about flexibility that might be smarter than rigidity. It was impossible not to feel the energy changing, as if a current of fresh air had entered the environment. Something that deeply touches the business world is understanding that true leadership is not about following protocols blindly, but knowing when to adapt them to serve better. While James processed the sale, Steph approached and said something that would forever change that dealership's philosophy. "You know, James," Steph began, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had led teams under extreme pressure. "I've led basketball teams where following the playbook to the letter sometimes meant losing the game. The best leaders know when to improvise. How is it possible that a basketball lesson can revolutionize sales strategies?" James stopped typing and turned to Steph, realizing he was about to receive a leadership masterclass from one of the most successful people on the planet. "Procedures exist to guide, not to blind," Steph continued, gesturing gently toward the showroom. "You have a talented team here, selling exceptional products. Imagine what they could achieve if they had permission to adapt their approach when the situation was unique." Suddenly, James began to remember other situations. The technology CEO who had left frustrated because he wanted to pay cash for 3 cars for his children, but was forced to accept financing. The millionaire heiress who gave up the purchase because bureaucratic procedures made the experience unpleasant. How many extraordinary sales had he lost by defending inflexibility instead of embracing possibilities? "You're right," James admitted, his voice carrying a raw honesty that surprised even himself. "How many opportunities did we lose because our procedures were more important than our customers?" "We have our procedures for a reason," echoed in his mind for the fourth and final time. But now the phrase carried a completely transformed meaning. The reason wasn't to control situations, but to create structures that could adapt when necessary. What would you do if you discovered that your greatest future successes depend on having the courage to question your present practices? James finalized the sale, printed the documents, and extended the BMW X7 M50i keys to Steph, with a genuine smile that hadn't emerged from sales protocols, but from authentic human respect. "Thank you," Steph said, accepting the keys, "not just for the car, but for the lesson. You just showed that true business leadership is having the courage to grow." 3 months later, James Wilson's BMW dealership had established new sales records. The case-by-case analysis for exceptional situations policy had attracted customers who previously avoided the store due to inflexibility. Steph had become a regular customer, bringing athlete friends and recommending the dealership to other celebrities. Jennifer Walsh had been promoted to assistant manager, specializing in personalized service for unique customers. The sales team reported greater job satisfaction, feeling empowered to solve problems instead of just applying rules. The work environment had become more dynamic, creative, and paradoxically, more efficient. Naturally, this leads us to understanding that the best business happens when protocols serve people, not when people serve protocols. James had learned that intelligent flexibility wasn't abandonment of structure, but evolution of leadership. In James's office, now hanging on the wall next to his diplomas and certifications, there was an autographed photo of Steph Curry with his BMW X7 M50i. The dedication read, "To James, leader who knew how to adapt the game when necessary. Keep breaking your own rules to serve better." And every time James looked at that photo, he remembered that we have our procedures for a reason. And sometimes, the best reason is knowing when to change them to achieve something even greater than we ever imagined possible.